I'm Wolf Blitzer, and this is a special edition of the Situation Room. We have developing news tonight on a missile test conducted by Russia during President Biden's surprise trip to Ukraine yesterday. And it comes as the leader of the free world took on the autocrat trying to destroy Ukraine. President Biden delivering a fiery address in Poland today to mark the upcoming one-year anniversary of Putin's ruthless invasion. And on the other side of Ukraine, Vladimir Putin stood defiant as ever in Russia while updating Parliament on his war, putting his own usual spin on the truth, falsely claiming that Ukraine and the West started this conflict. Mr. Biden singled out the Russian leader by name 10 times in his speech, declaring, and I'm quoting now, Putin's craven lust for land and power will fail.
When President Putin ordered his tanks to roll into Ukraine, he thought we would roll over. He was wrong. He thought he'd get the Finlandization of NATO. Instead, he got the NATOization of Finland and Sweden. He found himself at war with a nation led by a man whose courage would be forged in fire and steel, President Zelensky. Democracies of the world will stand guard over freedom today, tomorrow, and forever.
Putin didn't mention President Biden at all in his speech. He did say he's suspending his country's participation in the New START nuclear arms reduction treaty with America. We are live around the world this hour. Christiane Amanpour is near the Ukrainian-Polish border. Phil Mattingly is in Warsaw. Matthew Chance is in London. Sam Kiley is in eastern Ukraine. And Tom Foreman is in Washington. Let's get straight to all the latest developments. Our senior international correspondent, Matthew Chance, has new information about that failed Russian missile test. And our chief White House correspondent, Phil Mattingly, is traveling with President Biden in Poland. First to you, Matthew. What can you tell us about this long-range missile test that Russia actually carried out while President Biden was in Ukraine?
Yeah, well, this clearly intended as a defiant show of force on the part of the Kremlin. As Joe Biden, US president, walking through the streets of the Ukrainian capital, shoulder to shoulder with President Zelensky, his Ukrainian counterpart. The test firing of this long-range intercontinental ballistic missile, we're told by US officials, didn't work. And so that's one of the reasons why I expect we haven't heard anything about it from the Kremlin side. They don't want to point to the failings of their own military infrastructure. I think one of the other important issues, though, is that what we've learned over the past couple of days is that the deconfliction channels between the United States and Russia are in some ways operational. The Russians told the United States, according to US officials, that this ICBM test launch was going to take place. So they gave them a heads up, just like the United States, according to the US National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, informed the Russians that Joe Biden would be walking around Kiev. And so despite all this bluster between the two sides, and we heard more of it today from these dueling speeches of the presidents of Russia and the United States, there are still communication channels that are open.
Phil Mattingly, how does the White House see the road ahead?
You know, Wolf, as dramatically divergent as the two speeches from the two presidents were today, implicit in both was a reality you hear from U.S. officials and administration officials. There is no clear end game at this point in time. There is a long road ahead, and that was a driving force behind President Biden's remarks here in Warsaw, trying to steel a coalition that has been remarkably durable, that has been able to stick together, more than 24 countries across continents with countervailing pressures on the economic side, the domestic side, sticking together through the course of nearly a year. And they know that they are going to have to stick together for even longer. When you talk to White House officials, they acknowledge that reality. They acknowledge the amount of work that lies ahead. And they acknowledge the fact that in all countries, defense industrial bases have certainly been winnowed. That will be something that will need to be addressed. New weapons packages will have to be sent to Ukraine. New funding will need to be developed and drawn over as well. But more than anything else, what you've heard from the president, what you heard from White House officials in recent weeks, but most certainly over the course of the last dramatic 48 hours, was that they need to steel for what's ahead. And part of what the president's message was tonight was about the importance of doing just that and the stakes and just how broad and wide-ranging they are, far beyond just Ukraine, Russia, and the United States, but for freedom, for democracy, and for a fight that has a generational tent and perhaps could be more than anything else in the years ahead, Wolf.
All right, guys, thank you very, very much. Stand by. Right now, I want to bring in CNN's Tom Foreman. He has a closer look at Russia's nuclear arsenal and what the suspension of this key treaty with the United States potentially could mean. Go ahead, Tom.
Hey, Wolf, Russia and the United States have 90% of the world's nuclear warheads, according to the Federation of American Scientists, with Russia estimated to hold a moderate numeric advantage, although, of course, every single nuke is a serious matter. The New START treaty says each country is limited to just over 1,500 deployed warheads ready to be used immediately. For example, researchers estimate Russia has 812 on land-based ballistic missiles, about 576 on submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and possibly 200 at heavy bomber bases. Modern thermonuclear weapons are much, much more powerful than the atomic bombs the U.S. dropped on Japan in World War II. In Hiroshima, an official U.S. estimate says perhaps 200,000 people died from the blast and related sickness over 5 years. Now some scientists say a single big nuke dropped on a major city could kill more than 500,000 people instantly. What's more, some nukes are designed for very specific purposes. For example, researchers say a Russian government document indicates their long-range nuclear torpedo, known as Poseidon, could travel thousands of miles underwater to strike harbors, creating, quote, areas of wide radioactive contamination that would be unsuitable for military, economic, or other activities for long periods of time. And none of this even addresses the idea of Russia's shorter-range nukes designed for battles like those with Ukraine. Treaties to control or limit all of this date back to 1963, and the latest extension of the New START treaty signed by the U.S. and Russia in 2021 was supposed to last 5 years. But now Russia, while not officially pulling out of the deal, is suspending its participation, even as some nuclear control advocates say there is no provision in this deal for a suspension. Russia either fulfills its duty or breaks its promise. Wolf?
Tom Foreman, thank you very much. And just a little while ago, I spoke with the former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson. He's dealt with Vladimir Putin on the world stage over the years. He's also one of the first world leaders to visit President Zelensky in Kyiv soon after the Russian invasion, and has made multiple trips to Ukraine since then. Prime Minister, thank you so much for joining us. Let's get right to the questions. Thank you. In Vladimir Putin's twisted, totally false narrative that we heard earlier today, it's the West that started this war and is trying to destroy Russia. How do you read his mindset going into year 2 of this war?
I think he's pretty desperate. What he said is, of course, ludicrous. The West had absolutely no role in starting this war. This was a war of choice that he initiated. It was his vicious and unprovoked attack on Ukraine February the 24th last year that started this war. Ukraine was never going to join NATO in any realistic timescale. He knew that. He did this for his own, principally for his own domestic reasons, and he wants to rebuild the Soviet Empire. He is currently failing in all his key strategic objectives. Wolf, he failed to get Kyiv, he failed to conquer Kharkiv, and he's failed in Kherson as well. But the war is very bitter, very bloody, and he needs to be pushed out of the whole of Ukraine, and we need to give the Ukrainians the help they need now.
Very strong words from you. I know you dealt with Putin, and I remember right at the start of this brutal invasion, you were then prime minister, and you made an extraordinary claim to the BBC that Putin almost jokingly suggested that he could take you out with a missile. You remember that. What can you tell us about that exchange?
Yeah, well, this is in the course of one of the conversations I had with Vladimir Putin in the run-up to his invasion. And what he's trying to do is to creep us out. And as he did in his speech today, to try to introduce into the conversation continually the idea of nuclear missile exchanges, the unpredictable consequences of this becoming a nuclear conflict. It's very, very important. We don't allow him to do that. We don't allow him to frame this conflict as some kind of nuclear standoff between nuclear-armed NATO and a nuclear-armed Russia. This is about the invasion of an innocent European country by conventional means, and us, friends and supporters of Ukraine, particularly the United States of America, the UK, and many others, helping the Ukrainians to defend themselves by conventional means. We mustn't allow Putin to take us down that nuclear rabbit hole, if you like.
How powerful was it, Prime Minister, for the President of the United States to make that secret trip, risky, to Kyiv on the eve of the anniversary of the start of the war? You yourself have made that same trip several times.
I think it's fantastic that Joe Biden did that. I congratulate him. And I think, as far as I understand the matter, this was one of the first times in history that the President of the United States has gone outside an area where the U.S. Air Force can exercise direct control. I've done that trip several times. I know that train very well. You sleep on a double bed. We're surrounded by all sorts of commie bling because this is a communist-era train. The presidential train, and every time you bump over the points, and it's a very, very bumpy track, you keep thinking you're being hit by a missile. So this was certainly how I felt the first time I did it. It was exactly the right thing for the president to do. I applaud him, and I thought his speech was excellent.
As you probably know, there are some critics here in the United States on the fringes, shall we say, who accuse President Biden of prioritizing this war over domestic problems, and Republicans like Florida Governor Ron DeSantis questioning what he calls the blank check to Ukraine. Is that something that worries the UK right now, worries our Western allies?
Let me be absolutely clear with everybody. The investment in supporting the Ukrainians is a massive economy if it helps protect our peace in the long term. If we fail to expunge Putin from Ukraine, if the Ukrainians lose, then the jeopardy for the whole Euro-Atlantic security area, for the United States, is all the greater. And of course, the risks of read across in the Pacific are all the greater. By helping the Ukrainians to win, by decisive action, by giving them what they need now, and I'm talking about more tanks, and more planes, and more long-range artillery, I believe that the Ukrainians can and will win, and that will be of decisive importance for Western security. And my message to all my American friends is this will save us all money in the long run.
Because I know you say it's time for the UK to cut to the chase and provide Ukraine with fighter jets. If the UK takes that step, how long would it actually take, though, to complete the training, to deliver the aircraft, to actually make a real difference out there on the battlefield?
Well, Wolf, this thing's been going on for a year. And we all know that in the course of the last year, we've eventually, having exhausted all the other options, we've given the Ukrainians what they need, whether it's the anti-tank missiles or whether it's the HIMARS systems or whether it's now tanks. We always, sooner or later, come to the right answer and give the Ukrainians what they need. Well, if it's going to be sooner or later, if that's the choice, then let's give them what they need sooner, because that is the humane, the compassionate thing. Finish this war as quickly as possible, minimize the bloodshed, minimize the suffering, minimize the expense. And if we'd started giving them aeroplanes a year ago, we'd be that much further down the track. I don't believe it will take that long to train people up to fly either Typhoons or F-16s or Gripens or whatever we decide we're able to give them. But let's get on with it. And if it's a question of sending people who can do the avionics and the ground stuff as well, training people to do that, then let's train them as well.
So can I assume, Prime Minister, that you're calling on President Biden and the U.S. to start providing these F-16 jets to Ukraine?
That is correct. And I think that the logic of what we've been doing is to continue to give the Ukrainians what they need to protect themselves, to protect their hearth and home, to protect their families, to protect their country, and to expel Putin from the areas that he has conquered, at least since the invasion of February the 24th last year. And in my view, now I think the Ukrainians have an ever stronger case for getting him out back to the 1991 borders. That's the Ukraine that people voted for in 1991. That's the country to which they're entitled.
I know, Prime Minister, you share the U.S. concerns when it comes to China's support for Russia's war. What changed China's calculation on possibly starting to provide lethal weapons to Russia?
Well, look, I mean, everybody see what Tony Blinken said about China. I am concerned about that. I think it would be very wrong of the Chinese to support Vladimir Putin in that way. Why would Beijing now want to be contaminated by what Putin is doing? Why would they want to be associated with this gangsterism and adventurism? I think it would be a disaster for China. And I hope very much that it won't prove to be true. But if it is true, it shows all the more clearly why we must now accelerate our support for Ukraine and double down on giving them what they need. And as I say, if not now, when?
Before I let you go, Prime Minister, I know you've built a very deep and strong relationship with the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. How do you think history will remember his leadership in this fight?
I think Volodymyr Zelensky will be remembered forever as a president of a free Ukraine who not only mobilized and galvanized his people, but found the language to appeal to people around the world. And I can tell you that here in the United Kingdom, you will see Ukrainian flags in people's windows of their homes. You'll see Ukrainian badges on people wearing Ukrainian ties, Ukrainian flags flying from church spires. Such is the sympathy and compassion that he has evoked. He has been a truly inspirational war leader. And in one crucial respect, he has successfully mimicked Winston Churchill himself, because it is clear from what Joe Biden had to say this afternoon that Volodymyr Zelensky has mobilized the United States of America. And when America comes in on the side of freedom, as America is today in Ukraine, in my view, there is only going to be one outcome. This is a war for independence. The Ukrainians are fighting for their independence. And history teaches us that wars of independence only end one way. And with the United States on their side, I've got absolutely no doubt at all that the Ukrainians are going to win. But since that is the case, let's minimize the suffering and give them what they need now.
The former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, thanks so much for joining us.
You.
Really appreciate it. Up next, exclusive, the president of Poland, a country playing a key role in Ukraine's fight for freedom. He just spoke with our Christiane Amanpour. Plus, CNN goes inside a Ukrainian town that's evacuating right now over fears it's next on Vladimir Putin's target list. Stay with us.
The rise and fall of HQ Trivia takes you back to 2018 when either you or someone you know was trying to win money on a game show app that went viral. In fact, host Scott Rogowski became a pop culture sensation. HQ grew fast. So fast, the app crashed constantly, and behind the scenes, the two founders were at odds. From internet obsession to total meltdown. Glitch, the rise and fall of HQ Trivia, Sunday, March 5th at 9 on CNN.
Now to an exclusive interview with a major player in the global alliance supporting Ukraine. CNN's chief international anchor, Christiane Amanpour, sat down with President Andrzej Duda of Poland, a key member of NATO, soon after President Biden's speech earlier today in Warsaw. Christiane is joining us now live from Poland. So Christiane, what did President Duda have to say about President Biden's speech and his truly historic visit?
Well, he has been really thrilled that President Biden has come here on this particular anniversary. And of course, Poland obviously was involved with President Biden's trip into Ukraine because he had to take the train from the border, quite close to where I am, into Kyiv. So when I spoke to him, especially after that huge, fantastic set piece that they set up for President Biden's speech, he told me that he thought it was absolutely the right message at the right and crucial time. How significant is this moment for you? Before President Biden arrived, you said the speech, the meeting would be of global significance and dimensions.
Może zacznę od tego, że
So let me start by saying that these 2 days, today and yesterday, this surprising presence of President Joe Biden in Kiev, it sends an incredibly powerful signal, a political and strategic signal. It is a demonstration of strength of the United States, indeed. It is like saying that the American leader, who as a matter of fact is the leader of the free world, is able to travel even where war is raging, even to a place where there is a potential danger. He is not afraid because the United States is strong enough to protect him. That is number one. And number two, he was there, and today he is in Warsaw. He gives his speech to the whole world, because we have to say it like this. This is the speech by the President of the United States. As I said, the leader of the free world. It is a speech addressed to the whole world. And he sends a signal of the defense of the free world, of the defense of NATO, of the defense of every inch of the territory, as the President said today. So to us, to Poles, this American signal, this allied signal, not only within NATO, but first of all, a signal sent by the greatest superpower in the world, a signal sent by our friend and ally today, is so significant.
So the United States and all you allies have stood united. And the president today said that Vladimir Putin did not think that you would all remain united, you would remain so strong, and that Kyiv, Ukraine, would still remain free. What more needs to be done? All the weapon systems that you've been sending, what more needs to be done to ensure what you say is Ukraine's victory in this war?
The difference of potentials between Ukraine and Russia is huge and obvious. Everybody actually expected that it would take 72 hours at the most, the defense of Ukraine, and after 72 hours Ukraine would fall, it would be captured by Russia. On the 23rd of February 2022, I was in Kiev. I talked to Volodymyr Zelensky just a couple of hours before the Russian invasion. And at the last moment, actually, we made it to the Polish border because we traveled by car back then. So we crossed the border, and right after that, Russian missiles struck. So I remember when I said goodbye to Volodymyr, Volodymyr told me, Andrzej, I do not know whether we would see each other again. That was a very powerful moment, a moving moment. And then he told me, if Putin thinks that he would control Ukraine, conquer Ukraine, just as they used to, as they did with Crimea in 2014, then he is mistaken. We have got 80 years of combat experience and thousands of people who were fighting on the front. We are going to fight till the end, till we drop. And that is what has happened. And they are fighting until today. So first of all, what they need is weapons, because the difference is huge in terms of quantity. What Russians have got today is old equipment, very old equipment. They are taking tanks from 1960s from their stocks, but they have those tanks and they're crushing. They've got this advantage of steel, of the mass, and they are crushing Ukrainians. There are 140 million Russians and less than 40 million Ukrainians. So this shows you the mobilization potential of Russia and the mobilization potential of Ukraine. So it's enough to look at these clear data to understand that under normal circumstances, unless Ukraine gets support, it has no chance of defending itself on its own against Russia. That is why Ukraine needs this support. It's indispensable. What kind of support can we offer to Ukraine as allies? What the United States is doing, what we are doing as Poland as well. We have donated to Ukraine 300 tanks from our stocks. Right now, we are providing more tanks to Ukraine. At this moment, we are sending the state-of-the-art tanks that we have, Leopard tanks. We are providing a company of Leopard tanks. We have organized an allied collection, so to speak, of tanks for Ukraine. And this was what I was requested to do by Volodymyr Zelensky. Also, the Prime Minister of Ukraine asked for that. So we initiated that. Today, the key to make sure that Ukraine defends itself against Russia is modern weapons, so that Ukrainian soldiers can efficiently fight, so that they have means to push Russians with.
Even fighter jets?
Jeżeli będzie taka potrzeba, to tak.
If there is such a need, of course, yes. We still have got MiG-29s. Ukrainian pilots are prepared to operate them today. The question is, when will Ukrainian pilots be ready to fly modern aircraft at NATO standards, such as F-16s or Mirage, French planes, or Eurofighters, or any other type of modern machines? This is a question mark. When the Ukrainian pilots will be ready to do that, because the training of a pilot is much more complicated and much longer than the training for a tanker. So this is the way it is. So here is a question mark. When will Ukraine be ready with its own force to use such planes?
I realize that you're all sort of holding off on that, but I want to ask you about the Leopard tanks, which you were very vocal in unleashing from Germany. And yet this weekend at the Munich Security Conference, Chancellor Scholz told me that now Germany has to try to persuade you all with your Leopard tanks to actually send them to Ukraine. And there's been some slowness about this. When will your Leopard tanks get to Ukraine?
My jesteśmy gotowi do wysłania.
We are ready to send our tanks. Our tanks are ready to be sent. Right now we are training in Poland Ukrainian soldiers so that they are able to operate those tanks. I'm slightly surprised by the answer that Chancellor Scholz gave you. I hope that they are also ready with their Leopards because honestly we have got serious problems with getting spare parts to tanks. Spare parts from Germany. It's not only us. These problems are quite common. Other countries also have problems with Leopards because Germans have got a serious problem with providing spare parts. We do not understand this situation, but that's the way it is.
And Wolf, Polish president has been really rock solid, along with the Baltic states and all those who are around Ukraine and very close to Russia, in really mobilizing the Western response over this past year. But what you did hear there is not just big weapon systems are needed still for Ukraine, but a lot of ammunition. That is the most crucial element right now, as the NATO Secretary General says that they're having a hard time keeping up with how much Ukraine is using. Wolf?
Christiana Amanpour, thank you very, very much for that excellent interview. Just ahead, a liberated Ukrainian town on edge right now. They're preparing for an anticipated new Russian military offensive. Welcome back to a special edition of the Situation Room, turning now to the front lines in eastern Ukraine, where the bloody Russian advance is forcing so many civilians to evacuate. CNN senior international correspondent Sam Kiley has our report from a town many fear could be Vladimir Putin's next target.
A year into Russia's invasion, this monochrome misery is all too familiar.
This is what happened just 3 days ago here in Monochenivka, an S-300 missile strike. Now, that's a missile used by the Russians for ground attack, which is actually designed for bringing down aeroplanes, but it carries a massive warhead. It's pretty inaccurate, and that doesn't matter to the Russians because this is all about smashing up the villages and towns ahead of what the Ukrainians fear is going to be a major Russian push in this part of the country.
Captured on the second day of Vladimir Putin's invasion last February, this is no longer a town that scares easily. It was liberated by Ukraine in the fall and is within mortar range of Russian troops today. Yet these teenagers are taking a walk through what remains of their village.
Why do your parents not insist that you all leave as a family?
My dad has a farm here. He's got land, and we can't just leave it all behind, she says. So we just don't want to go yet. Well, if it gets serious, then we'll leave.
And how would you define really serious? In most countries, having a missile that big land in the middle of town is already really serious.
Very serious is probably when a lot of houses are destroyed and civilians suffer, she explains. It's the defiance of Ukrainian civilians that Russia is trying to crush. Putin's rockets and artillery have rained down on towns from Kherson to Kramatorsk to Kupiansk and the northern border with Russia, along a front line of 1,300 kilometers. That's 800 miles. This latest assault on Kherson, another example of the indiscriminate shelling of civilians. This isn't accidental, it's deliberate. The areas liberated by Ukraine bear the brunt of an ever-increasing level of attacks by Russia. Here in Kupiansk province, as in Kherson, civilians survive on aid rations. We don't know what to do, she says. Houses are shaking, missiles are flying. We just don't know what to wait for. We're shaking like chickens. We don't know what to expect. Fighting has been most intense in and around Bankrupt, with a surge in attacks by Russia on nearby villages in a foretaste of the anticipated offensive. Veterans like Alex, who captured this tank, called Bunny, from Russia last March, are running low on ammunition. He says that he's sometimes in combat with only 10 shells a day.
It's really hard. We have a lot of casualties every day. And the problem is that the fighting moved inside the city because we are fighting building to building, and the distance is 25 to 60 meters, so we cannot use artillery well.
Here, civilians place their faith in Ukraine's forces to hold off the Russians and play their part by staying on and staying alive.
Now, Wolf, according to the local authorities in Kherson, at least 6 people were killed, more than a dozen injured in the use of multiple rocket launching systems, an indiscriminate weapon, clearly intending to try to terrify the civilian population. As we say in that report, the civilian population, by and large in this country, is remaining incredibly resolute after 12 months of agony, of war, of murder, of shortages, of mass movements of refugees. And in many cities, particularly places in the east like Kharkiv, where I am now, or Kramatorsk, the population is actually beginning to return to something approaching normal, particularly because the Russians were pushed back from those gains they made in the early stages of the war. Wolf?
Sam Kiley reporting for us. Stay safe over there. Thank you very, very much. Vladimir Putin framing his war as a conflict with the West. We'll examine his long history with American presidents.
They're a new generation taking to the streets.
Erica Smiley is a longtime organizer and activist. What can the larger unions learn from the tactics that cracked open Starbucks, Amazon, and others? What can the new generation of activists learn from the old guard about sustaining a movement?
The new generation taken to the streets today are the ones who are winning.
Listen to The Assignment with me, Audie Cornish, on Spotify.
Vladimir Putin's fiery and provocative speech today took direct aim at the United States, marking a dismal low point in relations between the Russian president and his American counterpart. CNN's Brian Todd is joining us right now. Brian, Putin has a long and complicated history with U.S. presidents.
Wolf, Joe Biden is the 5th U.S. president that Vladimir Putin has dealt with in his 20-plus years as Russia's leader. The relationships, as Wolf has mentioned, have been very complicated, and almost all the American presidents in that period ended up getting a different Vladimir Putin than they thought they had at first.
I found it to be very straightforward and trustworthy.
George W. Bush had only been in office a few months when he swaggered out of a meeting with Vladimir Putin and made a declaration.
I was able to get a sense of his soul.
Almost immediately, then Senator Joe Biden tried to tamp down enthusiasm for the former KGB colonel.
I'd caution the administration against being excessively optimistic about Mr. Putin and his intentions.
Joe Biden is one of the American politicians who identified very early the type of man he was dealing with Vladimir Putin. He did not trust Putin.
10 years after his initial warnings about Putin, Biden, as vice president, met face-to-face with Putin in Moscow. Biden told a journalist that he said to Putin during that 2011 encounter, quote, "I'm looking into your eyes and I don't think you have a soul." Biden claimed Putin smiled and replied, quote, "We understand one another." Putin later said he didn't remember that exchange. And analysts say Biden hasn't always gotten the Putin portfolio exactly right.
During the Obama administration, Biden was given the charge for that, along with Secretary of State Hillary Clinton.
Obama, his vice president and Secretary of State, famously tried to hit the reset button with Putin's regime. But by 2013, the relationship was so bad that the two men could barely look at each other during a meeting in Northern Ireland. Then came Russia's invasion of Crimea and its intervention in Syria during Obama's watch.
I think Obama had a much more difficult time with him, trying to maybe understand where he's coming from, but failing in the end.
Obama's successor thought he'd figured out Putin and that he could cut deals with him.
I think I'd get along very well with Vladimir Putin.
But many analysts believe Putin played Donald Trump from the start, especially when Trump took the word of Putin over his own intelligence agencies, which had concluded that Russia had meddled in the 2016 election.
I have President Putin. He just said it's not Russia. I will say this. I don't see any reason why it would be.
That was the kind of thing where Putin was able, I think, in some ways, to very craftily control the room.
Putin has now been leading Russia across the administrations of 5 American presidents, a period when he's launched multiple invasions and allegedly overseen assassinations, hacking, and meddling campaigns, always while working the angles toward the person in the Oval Office he's dealing with.
He does, at least reportedly, employ some of the tactics he learned when he was in the KGB in terms of assessing, trying to find weaknesses in those who he's talking to and trying to exploit them.
Now, as for the future, the analysts we spoke to say they believe Vladimir Putin is always going to want to be seen as an equal with any U.S. president he deals with. They say they believe Putin wants to eventually negotiate directly only with President Biden to end the Ukraine war, something they don't believe that Joe Biden's ever going to go for, Wolf. He wants to involve the Ukrainians.
To do their fighting. They ask us for the implements of war, the planes, the tanks, the guns, the freighters, which will enable them to fight for their liberty and our security. We must be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself.
That was President Franklin D. Roosevelt's 1940 fireside chat, an effort to rally support for the British in the lead up to World War II. 83 years since FDR's speech, President Biden echoed that same sentiment earlier today at a time when polls show American support for providing aid to Ukraine is softening a bit. For historical insight, I want to bring in Doris Kearns-Goodwin, Pulitzer Prize-winning presidential historian and the author of the really important book, Leadership in Turbulent Times. Doris, thanks so much for joining us. I know you pointed out the connection between these two historical moments, two presidents trying to rally support at home while also sending a strong message abroad. Do you think President Biden accomplished that today?
I think what he was able to do was to rally